This week I was a little bit challenged to figure out which passage I was going to preach from, whether I was going to preach from Genesis or Mark or 1 Corinthians. I reviewed this on Monday morning, and Monday afternoon I was driving along, and as those of you who have ridden in the van with me know, the radio doesn't work. But I had the radio on, and it turned on. And what was being said in that time was, a man was presenting a book that he had written. Your remarriage formula, your remarriage checkbook is what it was. To see those things that will help you in your remarriage. Because one thing he said was, a remarriage is not the same as a first marriage. Your life wasn't the same in your first marriage when you got married at 20 or 19 or whatever. It's so much different at 50. You can't prepare the same way at both ages. So I presented that idea. There are two things that I took back from this. Two of those items on his checklist that are very important for marriage. And it'll lead into the sermon here from chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. The first is, there has to be good communication. There has to be good communication, especially in a second marriage, because you would have had habits that you would have formed in your first marriage that you may think transfer to the second one, but they don't. And the second one is that you need to be sure that there's leisure time. It's time for you to hang out, do stuff. It's very important in the first marriage, I will attest to that, but it's also important in the second marriage. It's that second chance. Just like we have a second chance when we're in Christ. We have a second opportunity. Now we start in this passage, and before we begin, we have to think about the context of what Paul was talking about in Corinthians chapter 6 and up to this point in chapter 7. He was talking about people who were living lives that weren't quite right. People who were taking the idea of marriage and just throwing it on its head. Doing detestable things, like we've talked about in the past, and considering them to be normal. So that's the Corinthian problem that Paul was dealing with in chapter 6. And when we get to chapter 7, we got the church in Corinth's problem. Instead of just listening and being true to their spouses, they took it another step. They essentially came home. It's like the woman who comes one day and says, "Sorry, honey, I'm divorcing you to become a nun." That's the situation. That's the situation that Paul is battling against. In order to have more time for the Lord, people were divorcing each other in order to dedicate themselves to prayer and service to God. But the very fact that they were separating was against what God would ever desire of them. That's the foundation of what he's talking about in here. That's the reason he starts talking about divorce in this passage. It's that idea of, I'm too good for you. I have to spend all my time dedicated to the Lord instead of my time dedicated to you. Instead of together we dedicate our time to the Lord. And I will do my best, as he talks about in this passage, if you have an unbelieving husband or wife, what do you do then? You stay dedicated to the Lord, and you stay dedicated to that spouse as long as they will let you, as long as you're able to. Paul says that he's not saying that you can't, that life doesn't happen. Life does happen. Things happen. People become irreconcilable. They cannot live together. And Paul provides a way out. God provides a way out in the Old Testament, not because it's his ideal, but because we're human. But because we're people with problems. But try as hard as you can. It's that idea, that marriage and remarriage checkbook. What are those things that you need to work in your marriage? What are those things that you have to work in your life? Communication, leisure time, and many other things that we have to do, whether we're in a first marriage or a second marriage, or even unmarried, and considering a future spouse. God calls us to something. The other situation here in Corinth is that, just like I've said many times, we were all something first. All these people, the majority of these people in the church in Corinth, were not people who were Christians and believers and in a church family from the time they were little. These were all adult becoming believers. And so they were all doing something. They were all in a job. They were all in some sort of vocation and living before they were called. And so are we. We were all something else first, and we've all been doing something else first. Paul is saying, in a modern way, just because you're a Christian, it does not mean you have to move to Africa. Just because you're a Christian does not mean you have to become a pastor. Not everybody is called to be a teacher. Not everybody is called to be a doctor. Not everybody is called to be a lawyer, thank God. Not everybody is called to be a construction worker. We are called to something. And what God is telling us, what Paul is saying is, wherever you are, God has placed you there for a reason. Be a witness. This doesn't mean that He might not call us out later, because He does. He can. Otherwise, we'd have never left our home when I was little. I would still be living in New Jersey. As a matter of fact, if you go back further, I'd still be living in Holland. But God calls us to different places at different times. But what Paul is saying is, just because you became a Christian doesn't mean that you have to pull yourself out of your workplace. Just because it's challenging doesn't mean you're being called to take yourself out of your marriage. He's calling you to serve Him where you are. You all know the old saying, bloom where you're planted. Serve where you are.